In the early 1950s, a journalist at the New York Herald Tribune named Otis Guernsey Jr. wrote Alfred Hitchcock this letter. The letter contains an idea for a film he previously discussed with Hitchcock many years before. He writes, "A diplomatic controversy exists in a Near Eastern country involving possibly something active, like the smuggling in of American arms collected in Europe, where they were sold or abandoned and brought in to create a sub rosa rebellion. That the good guys, in order to decoy the bad guys' espionage, create a fictitious character of a master spy. That a young, ingenious American salesman entering the country for respectable purposes is saddled by accident with this identity. That, subject to this unexpected melodrama, he turns like the American worm always does and tries to clear himself. That in the course of his searches, he meets a girl who is part of the good guy's plan to establish the fictional master spy. And finally, that he contributes to the downfall of the bad guys in a flurry of denouement and romance." This is the germ for what would become North by Northwest. Today I want to take a look at how Alfred Hitchcock and screenwriter Ernest Lehman managed to take a vague mistaken identity concept and a Hitchcockian set piece and turn it into the iconic adventure we have come to know. This is Making Film. North by Northwest came about during a period of writer's block while Hitchcock and Lehman were working on the script for a film titled The Wreck of the Mary Dear. It was based on a famous legend called The Mystery of the Marie Celeste, where a ship was discovered sailing in the Atlantic with nobody on board. The lifeboats were there, the galley stove was still hot, and there were remnants of a meal. It's an intriguing concept, so why were they having so much trouble writing it? The problem was that the concept was so intriguing. Hitchcock said, "There's so much mystery from the very outset that the attempt to explain it is bound to be terribly laborious, and the rest of the story never quite lives up to the beginning. But as soon as you go into the explanations, the whole thing becomes very trite, and the public is apt to wonder why you didn't show the events that led up to this point." So they decided to scrap the Mary Dear story and start working on a new story. So with the master spy concept in place, Hitchcock discussed with Lehman some of the ideas he had for interesting visuals or plot points he's always wanted to try. One was to be the longest dolly shot in cinema history, following start to finish, the construction of a car in an automotive plant. Once the car is built, it is discovered that there is a dead body in the back seat. Another idea was that a speaker at the United Nations would refuse to continue their speech until the delegate from Brazil wakes up. The delegate is tapped on the shoulder and falls over dead. The only clue left behind is a doodle of moose antlers. This was actually going to be the beginning of the movie. Another of Hitchcock's ideas was at a family reunion by a lake. A 12-year-old girl takes a gun out of a baby carriage and shoots someone. There was an idea about ice fishing in Alaska, and a hand suddenly comes up out of the water. Most of these ideas didn't seem to fit with the concept except an idea Hitchcock had of a chase scene across the faces of Mount Rushmore. All of the ideas seemed to Lehman to be moving, quote, in a northwesterly direction, from the story's beginning in New York. Lehman began calling the project In a Northwesterly Direction until Kenneth McKenna, the head of the story department at MGM, suggested North by Northwest as a working title. The plan was to eventually change the title to something that made more sense. After all, North by Northwest isn't an actual direction. They played around with a few titles such as The Man in Lincoln's Nose, Breathless, and so on, but none of these seemed to satisfy Hitchcock and Lehman. As a side note, North by Northwest was the only film Hitchcock made for MGM. Hitchcock didn't really like the title North by Northwest, but McKenna wrote to Hitchcock asking him to keep the title as is. In the letter, McKenna writes, "While we are aware technically that there is no such point on the compass, our feeling is that the enormous amount of publicity containing this title with you and Cary Grant has built up a tremendous amount of value for the title. Were we to change now, even to the extent of switching the order of the words, we might be wasting a value for which there would be no compensation in being nautically correct. Some have pointed out that the title appears in Shakespeare's Hamlet. I am but mad, north, northwest. Lehman and Hitchcock even wrote in the screenplay that the crop duster attacks Thornhill from the northwest. So Lehman had the initial master spy, mistaken identity in New York concept, and an ending at Mount Rushmore, and now he needed to figure out what happens in between. Lehman decided to make Thornhill an advertising executive so that he could, quote, talk in a kind of clever repartee, rather than speaking in a straightforward manner. He thought Grant was well suited for that kind of character, and thought it would make the character more amusing. You'll notice that Thornhill's lines are often witty.
Not that I mind a slight case of abduction now and then, but I have tickets for the theater this evening.
It turns what might be a serious thriller into a fun, captivating adventure. Another thing to note is that this is an ordinary man thrust into an extraordinary situation. We can identify with Thornhill and wonder what we might do in this situation. This is a staple of Hitchcock films.
But I've always gone for average man, the ordinary individual, going through extraordinary experience.
Is that the basic theme that you look for if you're looking for a story to film?
Whether I want to or not, I seem to gravitate toward that. The movie I made, like North by Northwest, Cary Grant. It's an ordinary businessman. Gets mistaken for a spy. And of course he goes through the most bizarre experiences. Well, it enables the audience to identify themselves much more closely with the individual.
Lehman didn't write a treatment. Instead, he wrote a partial outline just about up to the third act. He had several story conferences with Hitchcock and had a basic idea of where the story was going to go. He wrote out some ideas on index cards and arranged them to get a general idea of the structure. To get into the mindset of the story during the actual writing process, Lehman himself visited the actual locations where the story would take place in order to get a feel for the location. He went to Grand Central and took the 20th Century Limited to Chicago, went to the Ambassador East Hotel, and then took the bullet train to Rapid City, South Dakota. He hired a forest ranger and just started climbing Mount Rushmore. He wanted to see what was at the top, but he got frightened of possibly falling to his death and gave his Polaroid camera to the ranger to take photos up there. He realized that he didn't know how to write the scene of Thornhill getting arrested for drunk driving. So he went to a judge in Glen Cove, Long Island, and had him take him through the process of getting arrested for drunk driving.
All right, let's just go inside.
I don't want to go inside. Somebody call the police.
Come on. Come on now.
Going to the actual locations was most important for the scene with the murder at the United Nations building. Lehman spent 5 days at the building to see if he could find the perfect spot for a murder to take place. There was a problem though. A film titled The Glass Wall was shot there, which prompted the Secretary General of the United Nations to forbid the shooting of fiction films in and around the building. When the UN discovered what Lehman was doing, they realized that Hitchcock was attempting to use the UN building in his new movie, so they kept extra vigilant. Hitchcock had a photographer get permission to take pictures inside the building, and Hitchcock, pretending to be a normal visitor, followed him around whispering things like, "Take that shot from there, and now another one from the roof down." Then they used the photos as reference to construct an exact replica of the Delegates' Lounge on a soundstage in Culver City. In the film, they called it the Public Lounge out of respect for the United Nations and to help explain how a man was able to get a knife into the building. A public lounge would likely have less security. They did manage to steal this shot of Cary Grant walking up to the United Nations building, which they weren't allowed to do. They concealed a camera in the back of a truck made to look like it was from a carpet cleaning company. It's kind of funny how Cary Grant just walks up past an officer who has no idea he's in a Hitchcock movie. The carpet cleaning truck is also how they got the background for this shot of Grant in front of a projection screen. In an interview, Lehman said, "Since I never knew where I was going next, I was constantly painting myself into corners and then trying to figure a way out of them. As a result, the picture has about 10 acts instead of 3. And if I tried to sit down at the beginning and conceive the whole plot, I could have never done it. Everything was written in increments, moving a little bit forward, then a little bit more, one page at a time, saying to myself, okay, you've got him out of Grand Central Station. Now he's on the train, now what? Well, there's no female character in it yet, I better put Eve on the train. But what should I do with her? And where should they meet? Well, let's see. I've ridden on the 20th century. How about the dining car? That's the way it went, very slowly, always asking, what do I do next? So in the end, the audience never knows what's coming next, because I didn't either. This creates a very unique story. We usually watch movies with the mindset that we are in the hands of a storyteller with a solid plan. In this way, North by Northwest is almost like improvisation. I think it works because the writer and the character are having a similar experience over the course of the story, which causes the audience to share in the experience as well. Thornhill spends pretty much the entire movie unable to understand why these things are happening to him. He's along for the ride just like we are, and we are better able to relate to him because he doesn't have the experience that a character like James Bond has. While watching North by Northwest, we feel like we could get swept up in this adventure just like Thornhill was. And it actually swept up Cary Grant as well. At one point, he told Hitchcock, "It's a terrible script. We've already done a third of the picture, and I still can't make head or tail of it." One thing we need to touch on is the MacGuffin. Now, you've probably heard of this concept before, but if you haven't, here's a quick explanation. A MacGuffin is the thing that drives or starts the plot, but is not actually important to the story. The MacGuffin in Pulp Fiction is the suitcase that Jules and Vince need to pick up and deliver to Wallace. But that's really not what the movie's about. In North by Northwest, it's a whole convoluted thing about hidden microfilm being smuggled out of the country, which we don't even really hear about until the end of the movie.
Why else would you have decided not to tell her that our little treasure here has a belly full of microfilm?
You seem to be trying to fill mine with rotten apples.
It's possible that Lehman didn't even come up with this until much later in the script. For this reason, I must admit, like Cary Grant, I also found the plot a bit hard to follow. For the audience's sake, they wrote a couple of scenes that in essence summarize the information leading up to that point. Filmmaker François Truffaut pointed out a specific scene like this when he was interviewing Hitchcock for his book, Hitchcock Truffaut. The scene he brought up was the one where Thornhill meets with the counterintelligence man at the airport. Hitchcock said, "That scene has a dual function. Firstly, it clarifies and sums up the sequence of events for the audience. And secondly, Cary Grant's account is the cue for the counterintelligence agent to fill him in on some of the missing elements of these mystifying events." This has its roots in the silent era, where they would put up a summary title card halfway through the movie for the people who arrived late. However, you'll notice that part of their conversation was drowned out by the sound of spinning plane propellers.
We'll discuss it on the plane.
This was a way of not only censoring information that the audience already knows, but they can mess with time as well. Instead of repeating the same information from the previous scenes for 3 minutes, they can have a 30-second exchange drowned out by the noise.
I've got a job, a secretary, a mother, 2 ex-wives, and several bartenders dependent upon me. And I don't intend to disappoint them all by getting myself slightly killed.
Lehman would write a small amount of the script every day, with the knowledge that this probably wasn't going to work. He was experienced, but he had never written a movie without a real plan before. Hitchcock left to go direct Vertigo, while Lehman stayed behind and worked on the script. Sometimes he would work for a whole day and end up with just half a page completed. He tried to quit the project several times while Hitchcock was away directing Vertigo, but was convinced by his agent to stay on after already quitting The Wreck of the Merry Deer. Lehman only had 65 pages completed by the time they began pre-production. He sent the pages to Hitchcock, who was still in the Bahamas on vacation, and Hitchcock wrote back that he loved the story so far. At this time, Hitchcock's main offices were at Universal, so they packed up and moved to MGM to continue working. They began storyboarding and casting the film, and even after Cary Grant signed on to do the part, the rest of the script was blank. Lehman still had no idea who was involved in the chase on Mount Rushmore, how they would get there, and why they were going there in the first place. Lehman said, "So I called up Hitch and told him we were in big trouble.
Oops.
He came rushing over to my office, sat across from me, and the two of us stared at each other. Finally, he suggested we call in some mystery novelists to help us kick around ideas, but I didn't like the idea. After all, I was getting paid by MGM to write the thing, and I felt that it would make me look pretty foolish. Then we went to his office. It was about 6 o'clock in the evening, and we kept talking about his idea, even discussing which mystery writer we should get. And all the time, the right side of my brain was working, and suddenly, as I was listening to him, not really ignoring him, I said, "She takes a gun out of her purse and shoots him." Lehman spoke in many interviews about this moment. He says that often the right side of your brain keeps trying to sort out problems in the background even when discussing something else. Hitchcock responded to Lehman's idea, saying, "Yes, the Polish underground sometimes killed their own members just to prove they weren't in the underground." Then Lehman replied, "Yes, but these are fake bullets. That'll convince Van Damme that he has to take her away with him. Now that she's a fugitive, he'll decide to take her on the plane." Lehman said that after this exchange with Hitchcock, he instantly had the entire last act. The strange thing is that MGM wanted to cut down the important scene following the shooting, the one where Eve and Thornhill meet in the woods. Saul Siegel had Lehman and Hitchcock come down to the screening room to review the scene, and he begged Hitchcock to trim it. Hitchcock pushed back, later saying, "It's indispensable because it's truly their first meeting since Cary Grant has learned that she is James Mason's mistress. And this is the scene in which he finds out that she is working for Central Intelligence. My contract had been drawn up by MCA, my agents, and when I read it over, I found that, although I hadn't asked for it, they put in a clause giving me complete artistic control over the picture, regardless of production time, cost, or anything. So I was able to say politely, 'I'm very sorry, but this sequence must remain in the picture.' Aside from not allowing Hitchcock to film at Mount Rushmore, they also refused to allow him to film any scene involving violence on the faces of Mount Rushmore in a soundstage. Lehman sent an extremely patriotic letter to the National Park Service 3 days before turning in his first draft of the scene to try and convince them. The letter reads, "The monument saves Eve and Roger. The enemies of the country fall to their deaths from the monument of the great presidents who gave this nation the very ideals they are seeking to subvert. We sincerely believe that it will be symbolically and dramatically satisfying to the people of the U.S. that this great national memorial, standing there in all its granite glory, becomes the stumbling block to those who would undermine our country. In the end, the enemies of democracy are defeated by democracy itself." The letter didn't seem to work. They were forced to set the scene not on the faces of the presidents, but in the spaces between them. And Hitchcock removed the credit, thanking the National Park Service. There were a few changes made in the second draft of the script, including a name change for George Kaplan, previously George Rosen, and changing Eve Kendall's profession, which was previously an interior decorator. The change was made because there was a real interior decorator named Eve Kendall in New York. This is the same draft of the script that introduced the middle O initial to Roger Thornhill's name, which the character says signifies nothing. However, it could allude to the fact that George Kaplan doesn't exist. In one of the drafts of the script, the play that Thornhill was supposed to see with his mother was actually West Side Story. What's weird is that Ernest Lehman would go on to write the film version of West Side Story only a few years later. Hitchcock also had a different plan for the opening credits, which they couldn't do because they were already more than $1 million over budget. Hitchcock detailed his ideas in a memo from December 18th. He writes, "The main purpose for the title would be to establish Cary Grant as an advertising man. We would reveal him in his office before we show any titles, and then let the cameras roam over the tables in the layout room. There would be a rough series of layout cards in various stages of completion. These cards would be like proposed advertisements in Life or other magazines, but they would actually be our main and credit titles. This would be followed by an exodus of people at 5:30 down the corridor of the building, and so on into the material we have already shot of the activity around Madison Avenue at this time. Cary has already indicated to me that he will not charge anything for his services when the time comes, if and when we do this style of introduction. This idea would have cost $20,000 to complete, even if they didn't have to pay Cary Grant's $5,000 fee. Saul Bass eventually designed the opening titles. Once the script was finished, Hitchcock never allowed a word of the script to be changed, which annoyed Cary Grant at times. However, a few lines were put up on the chopping block by MGM. One line was where the villains were talking and Leonard says,
"Call it my woman's intuition, if you will,"
which would strongly hint that Leonard is homosexual. Obviously, the line remained in the film. A little more than a decade earlier, Hitchcock had 2 homosexual villains in his 1948 film, Rope. Arguments could be made about the sexual orientation of other Hitchcock villains as well. Another line was altered after filming. This one.
"I never discuss love on an empty stomach."
The line originally read, "I never make love on an empty stomach." Hitchcock had a lot of back and forth with the production code office on this film. Their production code was the, quote, "set of industry moral guidelines that was applied to most United States motion pictures released by major studios from 1930 to 1968. This has since been replaced by the MPAA, but like the MPAA, the production code limited what you were allowed to say and do in an American movie. The production code office wanted to downplay Leonard's effeminate nature. They also wanted Hitchcock to remove a reference to Thornhill's 2 previous marriages, which according to the production code would be offensive to Catholics. The reference remained.
My wives divorced me.
Why?
Oh, I think they said I led too dull a life.
Another issue with the censors was the end, in which Thornhill and Eve are shown unmarried and in bed together. To fix this, they dubbed in the line,
Come along, Mrs. Thornhill.
Thornhill had already proposed on Mount Rushmore, but it seems that the change irked Hitchcock because shortly after, he added a new shot to the list of retakes. The note reads, "Need shot of train going into tunnel." The original description in the script read, "Exterior train. We are shooting toward the rear of the observation car as the train rolls off into the night." This explicit metaphor of the train entering the tunnel was a little jab in the eye of the censors. According to MGM, the screenplay cost them $26,100. The fee was divided up like this. $25,000 went to Ernest Lehman, $1,000 went to Otis Guernsey for the initial idea, and $100 went to Hitchcock. Thanks for watching. You might notice that I didn't really talk about the famous crop duster sequence. That is because I've decided to make a full video breaking down what went into making the scene, so keep an eye out for that one. Thanks so much to all of my patrons. I'm starting to get hit by the demonetization issue, so your support really makes all this possible. Thank you. Click this button if you'd like to support what I'm doing here, and vote for video topics like this one. And if you're new here, please hit that subscribe button now because there are plenty more videos on the way for cinephiles like you. Thanks again for watching.